the weaver of Bonwire. Kofi Mensah came to the loom while the compound was still dark. The harmattan had been blowing for 2 weeks now. It came from the north each year, the dry wind out of the Sahara arriving in late November and staying through February or March, carrying its fine dust down over the forest country of the Ashanti hills. The harmattan changed the quality of everything. The air lost its wet season weight. The mornings that had been warm became cold. The sky, which had been blue and full through the long rains, became pale and flat, the dust suspended in the atmosphere thickening the light until the sun appeared not as a sharp disk but as a brighter region in a uniformly white sky. He had been waking into this same sky every harmattan for 47 years. It was the sky of his birth season. His mother had told him he had been born in harmattan, in a cold January in the main room of this compound, in the same room where he now slept. He did not know what it would feel like to wake into a harmattan morning in a different compound. He had never tried. He crossed the swept earth barefoot, his sandals left at the house door. The soil was cold beneath his feet. Dry season cold was different from wet season cold. It had no moisture in it, nothing that chilled. It desiccated. The surface of the compound earth in harmattan season had a faint roughness, a powdery quality from the dust that settled on it overnight, and his feet registered this as they registered the cold, not with discomfort but with recognition. The loom was covered by the old cotton wrapper he kept draped over it each evening. He had cut the cloth years ago from a wrapper that had worn beyond use and kept it at the compound for this single purpose. He untied the cords at the corners and folded the cloth back over the loom's upper frame, exposing the work he had left the previous evening. The strip on the beam was 4 inches of woven cloth. He had completed those 4 inches at the end of yesterday's afternoon session, setting the shuttle down when the light dropped below the threshold at which he could trust the colors. 4 inches on the beam in the woven state. When cut and relaxed, that section would measure 6 inches. The warp had been under tension for 11 hours since he finished. The dry harmattan air had contracted it further than usual. He walked to the far end of the warp to check the adweneasa. The drag board was a flat piece of timber with a collection of smooth stones piled on its surface, each stone selected for its weight, the whole assembly positioned at the end of the warp to maintain tension as the threads were drawn toward the loom through the progress of the weaving. His father had assembled this collection of stones over many years, adding and subtracting until the pile produced the tension that this warp required. Kofi had inherited the stones along with the loom, the bench, the shuttles, and the knowledge of what to do with all of them. The board had moved forward perhaps 2 centimeters overnight, drawn by the contracting threads. He pushed it back with his foot, feeling the ground resistance and then the release of the drag, and the warp threads above him tightened slightly. He pushed it another centimeter. He walked back to the loom and ran his hand along the nearest threads, feeling their tension. Taut and even. He made a small further adjustment, a centimeter less than half, and felt the tension settle into the right range. He set up the shuttles on the flat board at his right hand. There were 4 for this commission: yellow, black, green, and the deep burgundy that appeared in the border treatment. The shuttles were flat, pointed pieces of hardwood, each one worn smooth from years of use. The oldest of them had been his father's, the taper worn to a particular profile by long handling. He had made the others himself at the workbench in the back room, turning them one winter when there was time for such work. Each shuttle was slightly different in its worn smoothness from the others, each one carrying the history of the hands that had used it. He loaded the yellow shuttle with a fresh bobbin. The bobbin was a small cylinder of hardwood wound with the yellow thread, wound the previous afternoon before the light failed. He wound the bobbins by hand, drawing the thread from the large spool on the shelf and distributing it evenly across the bobbin's length with a slow back-and-forth motion. An evenly wound bobbin paid off cleanly through the shed without catching or bunching. A bobbin wound in a hurry produced small irregularities in the thread tension that appeared in the finished cloth as slight variations in the weft density. He never wound bobbins in a hurry. He drew the thread end through the notch in the shuttle's side and held it between 2 fingers, leaving a tail of 3 inches. He set the shuttle on the board. A wall gecko called from the compound wall, 4 sharp clicking sounds in the darkness, the territorial call that preceded the dawn. Then silence. The gecko appeared on the painted block surface of the near wall, visible in the first grey light, its body pressed flat against the surface, its small head turned outward at the angle geckos used for surveying the space around them. He watched it for a moment. Then it moved with the sudden darting speed of its kind and was gone into the crack between courses. The sky above the compound wall was becoming lighter. The harmattan grey was distinguishing itself from the night darkness, the eastern edge of the visible sky fractionally less dark than the rest. In a few minutes the light would be sufficient to see the thread colors correctly. He preferred not to use the candle in the early morning if he could avoid it. The candlelight was warm and showed the yellows as orange and the greens as something muddier than they were. He could work by candlelight when the commission required it, when a delivery date pressed, but he did not like what it told him about the colors. He sat on the low bench. It was a solid piece of wood, cut from a single plank and smoothed by rubbing, 22 inches long and 6 inches off the ground. He had made it himself in his early 20s, after he inherited the loom and found that his father's bench, slightly longer, now leaning against the storeroom wall, was not exactly right for his body. He had made the bench to his own sitting position, gauged by feel rather than measurement, and it had been right from the first day. He had sat on it every working day for 25 years. He settled his loom cloth over his lap. At the loom he wore a simple old wrapper, not the good cloth of occasions. The loom cloth was a piece he had retired from daily use some years ago when the colors had faded past the point of presentability, and it had been relegated to loom use. It was the softest cloth he owned, the softness of cloth that had been washed many hundreds of times. He looked at the length of warp ahead of him. The warp threads ran from the wooden beam at the front of the loom, a round rod from which the threads were suspended in their arranged groups and extended across the compound earth for approximately 4 meters to the adweneasa. They lay in the color arrangement he had set up 5 days ago when he began this cloth, yellow and black and green in the proportions and groupings that the pattern required. He had threaded the arrangement through the heddle frames of the ensadua, the loom, working from the front heddles back, each thread placed in its correct heddle according to the sequence he had known since his father taught it to him at 19. The pattern was adweneasa. It was the most demanding cloth he produced. The word meant something like "my skill is exhausted," a claim the pattern made on behalf of the cloth, indicating that its making required everything the weaver had. He had been making it for 22 years. He was no longer exhausted by it. But he was never careless with it either. Setting up the warp for the adweneasa took most of a day. He had done the setup for the Owusu commission 5 days ago, on a Saturday when the compound was busy with the weekend's household activity. He preferred to set warps on days with household activity around him. The company made the repetitive work easier. He was alone in the technical sense. No one touched the loom during setup, but the sounds of the compound gave the long, careful process its texture. He had started in the morning, before the dew was off the ground. The first step was measuring the thread. He worked with wooden pegs driven into the compound earth at precise intervals, walking the thread back and forth between them to lay out the warp length. The length determined the number of strips he could produce from a single warp. Each adweneasa strip for this commission was 60 inches in finished length, and he had set the warp for 8 strips worth of thread. 6 strips was the commission. The remaining 2 strips worth would carry forward as the starting thread for the next commission in the same pattern, if one came. He had measured out the warp threads in the color sequence, walking back and forth across the compound, the thread unrolling from the spool as he moved. The yellow threads first, in the count that the adweneasa required. Then the black in smaller numbers. Then the green, placed in the specific positions in the arrangement. He had counted every thread and confirmed the count before moving to the threading. The threading had taken the rest of the morning and a portion of the afternoon. He had worked at the loom, taking each warp thread from the measured bundle and passing it through the eye of its correct heddle. The asatia had 2 rows of heddle eyes, front left and front right. The asanan had 2 more. Each thread's position in the arrangement determined which eye it belonged in. The first thread of the pattern went to the first eye of the asatia front left, the second to the acacia front right, the third to the asanan back left, the fourth to the asanan back right, and so on through the full sequence until every warp thread was in its place. He had threaded each heddle with the same motion, the thread end taken in the right hand, passed through the small eye, caught on the other side by the left hand, then drawn through to the correct length before the next thread was taken. His fingertips knew the resistance of a correctly threaded heddle from the resistance of one catching on the cord, and adjusted accordingly. After the threading came the slay, passing each warp thread through the reed, a comb-like structure that ordered the threads and determined the spacing of the finished cloth. He slayed from left to right across the full warp, 2 threads per dent for the adweneasa's close warp setting. Then the attachment to the beam, and the first adjustment of the nitusuo to the correct weight for this warp's thread count and length. He had done all of this on Saturday in the way he had done it every time for 25 years. The setup was complete by late afternoon. The first pick of the commission had been a test pick in waste thread, thrown to verify the shed and confirm that every heddle was correctly carrying its thread. He had inspected the test pick closely, checking for any thread appearing on the wrong side of the cloth surface. All was correct. He had unpicked the test pick and started the commission thread fresh on Sunday morning. Setting up a warp was the part of the work that clients never saw. They came to collect the finished strips. They never saw the measuring and the threading and the slay and the first test throws. This was appropriate. The setup was the foundation of the cloth. It was invisible in the same way that the footings of a building were invisible, present in everything, visible in nothing. The ensadua's structure was the product of long refinement. The hardwood uprights were anchored at the base and connected at the top by a horizontal beam from which the kerai and the heddle suspension cords were hung. The heddle frames were suspended from this beam by the nyansu, the pulley arrangement that linked each pair of frames so that when one descended under treadle pressure, the other rose. The treadles connected to the frames by cords running from the foot position over the pulley and down to the frame. The cord lengths determined the depth of shed opening. Too short, and the shed was narrow, the shuttle struggling to clear; too long, and the warp threads moved too far, producing uneven tension. He had calibrated the cord lengths precisely when he was 25, working through each treadle in turn, weaving test picks and adjusting until the shed opened at exactly the depth that allowed a clean straight throw. He had not needed to change them significantly since. The loom had held its calibration through 20 years of daily use, which was what a well-built loom did. His father's loom, stored in the back room, had different cord lengths, calibrated to a different hand. The loom expressed the person who had set it up. This seemed to him a reasonable description of what any tool was, the accumulated adjustments of the person who used it, stored in the physical properties of the thing. The commission was from the Owusu family in Kumasi. Kwabena Owusu was a man in his mid-50s who had come to Bonwire 3 months ago in his own car, parking outside the compound gate and waiting politely while Kofi's wife went to find him. He had brought a photograph and a list. The photograph showed a cloth his grandfather had worn at a family durbar 30 years ago. The cloth in the photograph was partially visible at the edge of the frame. The image was not of the cloth but of the grandfather wearing it at some occasion, but the color arrangement and the basic block structure were identifiable to Kofi's trained eye. The list was specific. Yellow ground, black secondary color, green accent, burgundy border treatment. 6 strips for a man's cloth. The occasion was his oldest daughter's traditional marriage ceremony. A gathering of the 2 families. The pattern in the photograph was adweneasa. He had known the Owusu family had a history with this cloth. His father had mentioned the family. When Kofi examined the photograph carefully, he recognized the border treatment, the specific burgundy and black sequence in the selvage borders, as a treatment his father had developed for an earlier Owusu commission. The family had kept it. It was their cloth. He had confirmed this to Kwabena Owusu, and Owusu had been pleased in a quiet, considered way, the way people were pleased when something they had hoped was true turned out to be true. They had agreed on the price without difficulty and on the delivery date. Kofi had marked the date in his book and set the commission on the working schedule. He was 4 strips into 6. The delivery was in 10 days. He would have the final 2 strips done by the end of the week and the assembled cloth in Adjoa's hands before the weekend. He pressed the left treadle. The left treadle was connected by cords to the acacia, the front pair of heddle frames. When he pressed it, the acacia descended, and because the frames were connected by the cords running over the pulley bars, the nyansu above the loom, the back frames, the asanan rose. The warp threads divided, those threaded through the acacia went down, those through the asanan went up, and between them the shed opened. The shed was a long triangular space, narrow at the near end of the warp and widening toward the entibusuo, exactly wide enough for the shuttle to pass through without touching either layer of warp. He threw the yellow shuttle from right to left. It traveled the 3.5 inches of the warp width in a fraction of a second, the yellow thread paying out behind it in a clean horizontal line. He caught it on the left side with his left hand, and in the same motion reached for the kirai with his right. The kirai was the beater, a flat board of hardwood, the width of the warp plus 2 inches on each side, suspended from the loom's upper beam by 2 cords. He pulled it toward him, felt the new weft thread pressed down against the previous pick, and released it. Then he released the left treadle and pressed the right one, reversing the shed arrangement, the acacia up, the asanan down, and threw the shuttle back from left to right. Left treadle down, throw right to left, pull the kirai, release, right treadle down, throw left to right, pull the kirai, release. The rhythm was there from the first 4 or 5 picks. 25 years had placed it below thought. He did not construct the motion. The motion happened, and he confirmed it, and the cloth built on the beam pick by pick. He could think about other things while the ground section ran. The compound woke slowly around him. He heard the bolt drawn on the main house door, and Abena crossed the compound to the outdoor cooking area at the side of the house. She moved quietly at that hour, not wanting to disturb the household before she had the fire started and the water on. He heard the metal lid of the charcoal pot lifted, and then the sound of her breath as she blew on the coals from the previous night, and then the faint smell of the rekindled charcoal reached the loom. The smoke rose straight in the still harmattan air and dispersed above the compound walls. An agama lizard appeared at the top of the compound wall. It was the male, vivid even in the flat harmattan morning, the head a dense orange, the body blue-gray, the coloring so emphatic that it seemed improbable for a creature that did nothing more remarkable than walk along a wall. It moved along the top course with its deliberate stepping gait, placing each foot carefully, and stopped at the section where the wall received the first direct light of the morning. It oriented itself toward the warmth and stopped. It would stay there until the light moved on. The mango tree above the loom was in its harmattan state. The leaves were slightly curled at the edges, the dry air drawing the moisture from them as it drew moisture from everything. The tree's usual deep green was dustier, a fine layer of the harmattan particulates coating the upper surface of each leaf and muting the color toward gray-green. In the wet season, after the first rains, the leaves were washed clean and the green returned to its full depth. He had watched this cycle on this tree from this bench through many seasons. He was in a ground section of the adweneasa structure. The ground was the warp face background, the basic alternating shed sequence, left foot and right foot, that produced the plain weave ground on which the pattern elements were placed. In the ground section the motion was simple and continuous, and the cloth advanced steadily. He did not think about the ground picks individually. He confirmed their accumulation by periodically assessing the cloth on the beam, pressing a thumbnail against the weft to feel the density, verifying that the picks were lying evenly. The adweneasa structure had 3 main elements. The first was the warp face ground he was working through now, the background color, yellow in this cloth, produced by the alternating shed sequence, allowing the warp threads to dominate the cloth surface. The second element was the weft face block insertions, moments in the weaving where the shuttle passed multiple times through the same shed, building up a block of weft color that dominated the cloth surface in that section, interrupting the ground with a rectangular shape of concentrated color. The third element was the supplementary weft float, the most complex part, requiring the second pair of heddles to create additional pattern structures on top of the ground. The combination of these 3 elements, correctly arranged and executed, produced the dense, fully patterned surface that the name described. Every part of the cloth surface was occupied by something. There was no empty ground. The warp face sections showed the warp colors in their proportions. The weft face blocks showed the weft color in its accumulated density. The supplementary floats added a third layer of visual complexity. A weaver who could manage all three elements simultaneously, maintaining the correct sequence for each through the full length of a strip, was a weaver who had earned the right to say adweneasa. He had learned the structure from his father over the course of a year. The learning had been gradual and deliberate. His father had not been a man who taught by explaining in advance what would be learned. He taught by showing and by setting the learner to practice and by correcting errors when they appeared. Kofi had made many errors in the first months. Threading errors in the warp setup, which required the entire threading to be redone. Sequence errors in the pattern, where a shed was pressed in the wrong order and the pattern shifted by one pick, compounding into a visible defect over the following picks. Tension errors, where the warp had not been checked before a session and had drifted outside the working range, producing uneven pick density. Each error had been corrected. Each correction had left something in him. The pattern of 22 years was the accumulation of those corrections, the body and the hands having learned from each one what not to do, and in the avoiding of the wrong thing, finding the right. The first year of the adweneasa had been the most concentrated learning of his working life. His father had made him watch for 2 days before allowing him to sit at the loom. Not the casual watching that happened naturally when two weavers shared a compound. Deliberate watching, seated on a stool behind his father's bench with nothing else to occupy him, watching the hands and the feet and the shuttle and the kerai. His father had not explained the pattern while he worked. He had simply woven. Kofi had watched. What he had seen in those 2 days was not the pattern itself, which he could examine in finished cloth. He had seen the body mechanics of producing it. The specific motion of the wrist on the throw, not a simple lateral push of the shuttle, but a slight downward rotation that directed the shuttle's path through the shed at an angle, ensuring the thread cleared the lower layer of warp threads cleanly. The exact depth of the treadle press, not pressed to the stop, which overtensioned the heddle cords, but held at a controlled depth that opened the shed correctly. The motion of the kerai coming forward, driven from the elbows rather than the shoulders, which produced an even contact across the full width of the warp rather than a rocking pressure. On the third morning his father had stood from the bench and stepped aside. Kofi had sat. The loom was not calibrated for his body. His father was a larger man. The treadle depth and the kerai angle and the bench position were all his father's adjustments, not his. He had started badly. The first throw was too flat, the shuttle's path not angled enough, and it caught on the lower warp layer and stopped. He had retrieved it and tried again. His father stood behind him and did not speak. The second throw was better. By the 10th pick he had found something approximating the right throw for this loom, not the right throw for his own bench, which he had not yet built, but in accommodation with the loom that was in front of him now. His father had corrected him 3 times in that first session. Once about the treadle depth, pressing his son's foot to the correct position so he could feel it. Once about the kerai motion, placing a hand on the elbow to redirect the drive. Once about the wrist rotation, taking the throwing hand and demonstrating the turn without words. Those 3 corrections had settled into his hands. The wrist rotation was the last to become automatic. For nearly a year he was conscious of it with each throw. Then one morning he could place it, a rainy season morning, the grey light coming through the shed opening, the sound of rain on the corrugated roof. He had thrown without thinking about the rotation, and the shuttle had cleared perfectly. He had continued working without noting it. But it had been the morning the throw became his, not a corrected version of his throw. The threading errors of that first year were more instructive than the motion errors because their consequences were visible in the cloth and traceable back to their source. The first major one had been a misplaced green thread, one heddle eye out of position, producing a small area in the cloth where the color appeared at the wrong moment. He had found it himself on the 3rd pick. He had stopped and looked at the threading, and it had taken 40 minutes to locate the error and correct it, removing the thread from the wrong eye and passing it through the right one. His father had sat on his stool during those 40 minutes and watched. He had said nothing. The correction took longer than it would take him now. Now he could diagnose a threading error from its appearance in the cloth in a few minutes, working backward from the visible defect to the position in the warp that had caused it. This diagnostic skill was the practical result of the errors he had made. Each one had mapped a specific cloth defect to a specific threading position. The map lived in his understanding of the pattern. When an error appeared in a student's cloth, he could point to its source in the threading before examining the warp directly. He had taught Kweku using this same map. Kweku had made his own threading errors in the first months, and Kofi had made him find each error himself rather than pointing to it. The finding was the learning. Knowledge delivered to the learner without the effort of discovery did not hold. Knowledge arrived at through the learner's own investigation was reliable. His father had known this. He had taught with patience and with silence, offering correction when the learner had already tried and found the edge of what he knew, and not before. He reached the first weft-face block insertion of the morning at around the 8th row of the main repeat. He changed his foot position. Instead of alternating the treadles, he held the left treadle down and made multiple passes of the shuttle through the same open shed. The yellow weft accumulated in the block, each pass lying on the one before, building up the dense weft-face surface. He made 8 passes, released the left treadle, held the right treadle, and made 8 more passes in the reverse shed. The block was 16 picks across, its height determined by the number of passes in each shed, its width spanning the full strip. He released the right treadle and resumed the ground sequence. Left foot, right foot. The ground continued. The block insertion had taken perhaps 40 seconds. He had made this insertion hundreds of times in 22 years, in this pattern and in the variations of this pattern that different commissions required. He would make this insertion approximately 14 more times in the current strip, spaced at the intervals the adweneasa structure required. Across the compound Kweku's loom started up. He heard the familiar rhythm, slightly uneven still, the beat arriving a fraction late after the throw, but less uneven than it had been 2 months ago. Kweku was 24 and had been weaving in this compound for 2 years. He was the most promising of the young weavers Kofi had worked with, attentive, patient, willing to do the repetitive foundational work without rushing toward the complex patterns before the foundations were ready. Kofi had a theory about learning the loom. The theory was that the loom showed you what you were. A person who was impatient at the loom and the loom showed it immediately. A person who could sustain attention could sustain it at the loom and the cloth reflected that. Kweku could sustain attention. "Good morning," Kweku called from his corner. "Good morning," Kofi said without looking up. Abina brought tea at 7:30. She set it on the board at his right hand between the shuttles and the bobbin box. She knew better than to speak during a pattern section. She set the cup and went back to the house. He drank the tea between picks, the cup warm in the morning cold, the sweetness and the strength of it, something he associated with the early working hour. He had drunk this tea at this loom since Abina had been in the compound, which was 11 years. Before that his wife had brought it, and before that his mother, and before that, in the earliest years, when he was first setting up the compound's working day as a young man, he had made it himself and brought it to the loom in his own hand. The cup was warm and the harmattan was cold, and the tea was the correct connection between them. He thought about the Owusu commission while he drank. Kwabena Owusu had been direct and precise about what he wanted, in the manner of a man who had done this kind of transaction before and knew how to conduct it. He had not haggled on the price. He had not tried to shorten the timeline. He had said what he needed, set the date, and relied on Kofi to manage the rest. This was the right way to commission from a craftsman. A client who trusted the craftsman's judgment got better cloth than a client who tried to manage every decision. The daughter's marriage ceremony was a significant occasion for the family. Kwabena had described it briefly, a traditional ceremony at the Owusu compound in Kumasi. The two families gathered, the appropriate rituals. A day that required the right cloth. The right cloth for an Owusu elder at such an occasion was adweneasa in these colors, with this family's border treatment. Everything else was details. He set down the cup and picked up the yellow shuttle. The light was fully established by 8. The harmattan sky had settled into its characteristic flat white. The sun was above the eastern rooftop now, its disk visible through the haze as a brighter region, without the sharp edge that a clear sky would have given it. The compound was in the full morning light, the terracotta earth vivid under the even illumination, the mango tree's dusty leaves pale green against the white sky. The color of the yellow thread changed as the light strengthened. In the pre-dawn gray it had appeared almost white, the warmth of the gold suppressed by the cool, flat spectrum. As the morning light established itself, the color emerged, first cream, then pale gold, then the deep warm tone that his supplier in Kumasi labeled Ghana gold on the spool wrapper. By 8 the yellow was itself, the color of old brass, warm but not reddish, with a depth that suggested substance rather than brightness. He assessed the strip on the beam in this light. The yellow ground was solid and even. The weft face blocks were placed in the correct positions, the intervals between them consistent. The supplementary weft floats, the third element of the adweneasa, the most delicate, were correct in their placement and in the geometry of their shapes. The triangular forms and the small rectangular insertions of the supplementary weft were visible in the cloth surface as additional texture, the floats catching the light differently from the warp face ground around them. He looked at the selvage. On the near side, his right, the edge of the strip was straight and firm. On the far side, his left, it was the same. The selvage was where the weft thread turned at the end of each pick and began its return. A selvage that was too tight pulled the strip edges inward, narrowing the cloth. One that was too loose allowed the edge threads to pull outward, fraying the edge and making the strip too wide. His selvage was even. He had never had significant selvage problems. His throw had been accurate for 20 years. He returned the shuttle to its path. The mid-morning was the deepest part of the working day. The morning's preliminary work was done, the session established, the rhythm found, the first assessment of the strip completed. The midday break was still some hours away. Between these 2 points, there was only the work. He thought about nothing in particular during this phase. This was not absence of thought but a different quality of presence, the mind attending the work without directing it. The direction happened at the level of the hands and the feet. The mind confirmed what the hands were doing and occasionally intervened when a color change was coming or when a supplementary float section required the shift to the second heddle sequence. But mostly it moved alongside the work rather than managing it. He had tried to describe this state to Kwaku once, early in Kwaku's learning. Kwaku had asked whether the work became easier over time, meaning whether the demands on attention decreased. Kofi had thought about the question and said, not easier. Different. The attention becomes less effortful. The effort goes into the quality of the attention rather than into sustaining it. Kwaku had not fully understood. He was not meant to at 6 months of practice. Understanding required experiencing it, and experiencing it required years. Kofi had been at the loom for 5 or 6 years before the first indication of the different attention had appeared, and another 10 before it was reliably there. He noticed the sounds of the compound differently in this state. They did not intrude on the work. They were simply present as the work was present. Abina's footsteps between the cooking area and the house. The guinea fowls somewhere beyond the inner wall, their calls carrying over. The distant sound of traffic on the main road beyond the village. The birds in the mango tree above him. The green-headed sunbird was in the outer branches now. He saw it peripherally, a small bright shape, its plumage catching the morning light, and did not turn his head. The bird moved to a higher branch, probed the flower cluster there with its thin curved bill, then flew. He heard its sharp call as it left. He threw the shuttle. He thought about the yellow thread while the ground section ran. Not about the thread on the shuttle, that was managed below thought, but about yellow as a color in the adweneasa system. In kente, yellow carried gold, royalty, prosperity, the warmth of the sun, the status and maturity that the occasions this cloth was made for were meant to celebrate. A man who wore adweneasa at a family occasion was communicating something specific about his family's position and the significance of the occasion. The cloth was the communication. His father had not spoken about this directly. The symbolism was assumed in Bonwire the way the technical standards were assumed. You did not tell a weaver in this village what yellow meant in kente any more than you told a carpenter what straight meant. It was the foundation of the practice present before language. He had come to his own understanding of it through the commissions, the families who came to him, the occasions they named, the colors they specified. A funeral cloth had black dominant. A naming ceremony cloth had green prominent. A marriage cloth had gold centered. The current cloth said, "This family has prospered, this union is made with the full weight of that prosperity behind it, this occasion is met with the dignity that gold requires." The black said, "The ancestors are acknowledged." The green said, "The new household will grow and be well." The burgundy said more specifically, "This is the Owusu family's cloth, the border that this family has claimed as its own through 3 generations of commission." He threw the shuttle and beat and changed the shed and threw back, and the cloth continued to be made, and the statement continued to be woven into it pick by pick, the acts of the hands inseparable from the meaning they were producing. He had never spoken to clients about the symbolism. The symbolism was theirs, not his. He was the maker of the cloth, not the communicator of its meaning. His job was to produce the cloth that carried the meaning correctly. The meaning took care of itself. At 9 o'clock he checked the bobbins. The yellow bobbin currently in the shuttle was running low. He could see the thread thinning on the cylinder, the wood of the bobbin beginning to show through the last layers of thread. He would get 3 or 4 more complete picks from it before it ran out. He finished the current pick, set the shuttle on the board and removed the depleted bobbin. He loaded a fresh one from the box, drew the end through the notch and continued. This was the rhythm of the work that was not visible in the finished cloth, the constant small maintenance of the tools and materials that kept the weaving running cleanly. The bobbins ran out and were replaced. The heddle cords occasionally needed adjustment, a specific cord stretched slightly unevenly by use, corrected by a small tightening. The nettuesuo required repositioning as the warp advanced and as the temperature changed its tension. The kirai needed its angle checked when it began to press the picks unevenly. A slight drift in the cord lengths on one side caused this, corrected in 30 seconds. His father had called this work the first weaving. Before the thread went through the shed, before the pattern could be made, the conditions for the weaving had to be maintained. A weaver who neglected the conditions was building on a foundation that might shift. The shift would appear in the cloth. The cloth, when assembled, would carry the record of every morning the conditions were wrong. He had maintained his conditions carefully for 25 years. He checked the nettuesuo before the first pick of every session and after any break of more than 30 minutes. He checked the heddle cord tensions at the start of each week. He checked the shuttle for wear at the tapered ends, where repeated passage through the shed eventually rounded the taper and reduced the shuttle's ability to clear the shed cleanly. When a shuttle's taper had rounded enough to affect its travel, he replaced it. He had a shelf of replacement shuttles in the storeroom, made over the years to the same dimensions as the originals. Kwekyu came across the compound at mid-morning. He stood at a respectful distance from the loom and waited. Kofi recognized the posture, not quite finished with a thought, needing to ask something, and completed the pick he was on before looking up. "The border treatment," Kwekyu said. "The burgundy and black sequence. I want to understand the interval." Kofi looked at him. Kwekyu was not on an adweneasa commission. His current work was the stripe pattern for the church group. He was asking because he wanted to understand the adweneasa, not because he needed to know for his present work. "How many picks between each border appearance?" Kofi said. Kwekyu thought. He was not sure. "You have to count the strip," Kofi said. "Look at a completed strip on the shelf in the storeroom. Count the picks from one border to the next. Count the total picks in one full repeat. Then you will know the interval." Kwekyu nodded and went back to his loom. He did not go to the storeroom immediately. He returned to his own work and continued. He would go to the storeroom later, when his own session reached a natural stopping point. Kofi watched him settle back into his rhythm. This was the right way to learn, the question arising from observation, the observation leading to the directed examination of the actual cloth, the answer arrived at through the weaver's own hands and eyes rather than through explanation. Explanation without examination produced knowledge that was not secure. The hands needed to confirm what the mind had been told. His father had taught him the same way. He stopped at the end of the main body section for the morning's assessment. He leaned forward and looked at the strip on the beam from a distance of 3 inches, scanning across its full width. Not searching for a specific error, but receiving what the cloth offered. The yellow ground was even. He checked the pick density in 3 places by pressing his thumbnail against the cloth surface and feeling the resistance. Consistent throughout. The weft face blocks were placed correctly. He measured the interval between 2 adjacent blocks with the measure card, a small piece of cardboard on which he had scored the standard adweneasa intervals long ago. The measurement was correct. He examined the supplementary weft floats. These were the element most likely to show errors, because the float structures required the second pair of heddles to be engaged in a specific sequence that was different from the ground and the block sequences. An error in the float sequence produced a float that was either too long or too short, or placed 1 pick off from its correct position. He looked at the floats on this section carefully. They were correct. The triangular forms had the right proportions. The rectangular insertions were exactly as wide as they should be. He sat back and looked at the strip from working distance. The overall impression of the pattern was correct. The color relationships were correct. The yellow dominated. The black gave the ground its depth. The green accent, the element his family had added to this pattern, the slight green thread that appeared in specific positions in the warp face sections and was visible at an angle to the light, was present in the correct places. He was satisfied. He stood and stretched his back, rotating slowly until the familiar tightness in the left side released. Then he sat and continued. He thought about Bonwire while he worked through the mid-morning. The village was on the Kumasi-Mampong Road, 18 kilometers from Kumasi, in the Ajisu-Joban district of the Ashanti region. In the dry season the road was red dust, and the laterite banks were vivid at the junction where the Bonwire turn left off the main road. In the wet season the road was red mud, and the same banks ran in thin red rivulets. He had been driving this road for 30 years, and the quality of the red and the consistency of the dust in the dry season and the mud in the wet season were as familiar as the turning into his own compound gate. The village was weaving. This was its identity and had been its identity for as long as anyone's knowledge reached. The founding story, told by every grandmother to every grandchild, was of 2 friends from the village who had gone to the forest and observed a spider constructing its web. They had watched the spider lay its warp threads and pass the weft between them, the interlacing of one set of threads with another, and they had come back to the village and built the first loom. The spider was Anance, the trickster, the creator whose web was the model for all weaving. He did not know whether this was literally true. He knew it was functionally true. The spider's principle was the loom's principle, perpendicular threads interlaced to produce a surface that was stronger than either set alone. The warp running one way, the weft running the other, each holding the other in place, the cloth emerging from their intersection. This was what he did every day. Whether Anansa had shown the first weaver of Bonwire how to do it was a question above his authority to answer. What he knew was that the practice had been in the village for at least 500 years, that it had been refined through those years into a system of considerable complexity, and that his family had been part of this system for at least 4 generations that he could trace. His grandfather's cloth was in the chest in the back room. His father's cloth, the best pieces his father had made, was in the same chest. He had added several of his own pieces to the chest over the years, a commission that had not been collected, a cloth he had made for a family occasion that had later come back to him, 2 or 3 test pieces that had come out exceptionally well and that he had kept rather than sold. The chest was not opened often. It was not a museum. He opened it when he had reason to to compare a pattern he was working on with a reference piece, to show a client the quality of the family's work, to take out a piece for a family gathering. He knew what was in it without looking. He could describe every piece by memory, its pattern, its colors, the occasion it was made for, whether it had been his father's work or his grandfather's or his own. Bonwire on a working morning was the sound of many looms. He could hear them from the compound, the combined rhythm of the weaving households along the lane behind his compound wall, the overlapping beat of a dozen kirai from across the village, each one slightly different in pace and tone from the others. He had been hearing this sound for 47 years, and the absence of it, on festival days, on the rare occasions when he had been away, was one of the first things he noticed. The sound was the village's voice. It had been the village's voice for 500 years. The Weavers' Association market ran on Fridays. Cloth was sold from the central weaving compound on the main road, a space maintained by the association where completed work could be displayed and bought without a client needing to visit each individual compound. He sold through this arrangement for his smaller commissions, striped cloths, simpler pattern work, pieces made in advance of order. His major commissions, the adweneasa cloths and the other complex pattern work, were all direct. The client came to the compound. They agreed on specifications and price. He wove to the specification. He had been on the association's committee for 8 years. The committee managed the market arrangement, maintained quality standards for cloth displayed under the association's name, mediated occasional disputes between weavers, and kept the register of active weavers in the village. The register currently held 43 names. This was fewer than in his father's time, when it had held over 60. Some of the younger generation had gone to Kumasi for other work. Some had taken up the new industries that had come to the region. The craft continued, but the number who chose it as their primary livelihood was smaller. He thought about this without alarm. The craft had always been for a specific kind of person. Not everyone could do it. Not everyone wanted to. Those who did it seriously. A smaller number of serious weavers was preferable to a larger number of indifferent ones. The cloth that came from a serious weaver spoke well for the whole practice. The cloth from an indifferent weaver said nothing useful. The clients who came to Bonwire came because they wanted hand-woven cloth of quality. Kumasi had vendors who sold kente in the market, cloth from many sources, including machine-woven approximations that used the kente color arrangements without the hand-woven structure. These were cheaper. They were not the same thing. A client who knew the difference came to Bonwire. A client who did not know the difference bought from the Kumasi market and received what they paid for. The Owusu family knew the difference. The grandfather had known it, and the knowledge had passed through the family. Kwabena Owusu knew it because he had been shown his grandfather's cloth as a child and told where it came from and why it mattered. The cloth was the record. It carried the story of its origin. A family that kept its cloth carefully and knew what it was kept the knowledge that went with it. He had thought about this kind of transmission on the occasions when he encountered clients with cloth his father had made. The cloth was the record. A weaver's record was not in a book or a portfolio. It was in the compounds and storage chests of the families who had received it. Some of that cloth had been worn until it was worn out. Some was kept. Some had traveled through family histories in ways he would never know. The cloth he had made was in the world, doing what cloth does, wearing, aging, being used or stored or passed on, persisting in various conditions across the years. His grandfather's cloth in the chest was the oldest surviving piece he knew of from his family's work. His grandfather had been dead for 40 years. The cloth was in good condition. Very old cotton that has been properly stored develops a specific quality, a softness and slight lightness from the long relaxation of the fibers, the colors softened but not absent, the patterns still clearly readable. He looked at it once or twice a year. It was his clearest connection to a weaver he had never met. What he saw in the cloth when he looked at it was the quality of the hand. The pick density was consistent throughout. The pattern was correctly executed. The selvage was clean. These were the marks of a weaver who had done the work at the highest level available to him with the materials of his time. They were the same marks Kofi tried to produce in his own work. The thread was different, the colors were different, the commissions were different. The standard was the same. He thought of this as the continuity that mattered, not the name or the family history or the physical location of the compound. The quality standard passing from hand to hand across generations. His grandfather's hand had set the picks evenly. His father's hand had set the picks evenly. His hand set the picks evenly. Kwaku was learning to set the picks evenly. The line was not broken. His wife came out at 10 with a second cup of tea. She was going to the market and wanted to know if he needed thread from the supplier near the cloth sellers section. He thought. He had enough yellow on the shelf for the remaining work of this commission and one commission beyond it. He was low on the specific black. A spool of the black, he said. The Mensah supplier, not the other one. She knew which supplier. She had been buying thread from the Mensah supplier for 11 years. She left through the compound gate with her shopping bag, and the gate closed and the compound was quieter. Kwaku had stopped his weaving and gone to the storeroom, as Kofi had expected. He could hear the storeroom door and the sound of the folded strips being examined. Kwaku was doing what he had been told, looking at the completed adweneasa strips, counting the picks between the border appearances, understanding the interval from the cloth itself rather than from a description. This was the way the knowledge moved. Not from explanation to application, but from examination to understanding. Kofi had examined his father's cloths the same way. He had been given access to the storeroom when he was learning and told to look, and he had looked, and what he had found in the looking had stayed in him in a way that a verbal instruction would not have. He reached the border section of the current repeat at mid-morning. The border treatment was specific to the Owusu family commission, a band of 12 picks in the burgundy and black sequence at each side of the strip's full pattern repeat, the sequence his father had developed 30 years ago for the first Owusu cloth, and that the family had incorporated as their own. He set down the yellow shuttle and picked up the burgundy. He changed his foot position on the treadles, shifting to the sequence that produced the border shed. The border required the asanan, the rear heddles, to work differently from the ground shed, lifting a specific combination of threads to produce the wider spaced shed that the border required. He threw the burgundy shuttle. It passed through the border shed, the thread crossing the full width of the warp in its clean horizontal path, slightly different in trajectory from the ground shed throw because the shed geometry was different. He beat it home and threw it back. 4 picks of burgundy. Then he changed to the black shuttle and made 4 more picks. Then back to burgundy for 4, then black for the final 4. 12 picks total in the border section. The border band appeared on the cloth as a band of alternating burgundy and black, the colors clear against the yellow ground of the main body section on either side of it. He examined it briefly. The colors were in the right proportions. The transition from the main body into the border and back was clean. He picked up the yellow shuttle and resumed the main body sequence. The morning was at its longest run now, the 2-hour stretch from mid-morning to the midday meal when the pattern was established and running and the compound had settled into its working state. This was the productive heart of the day. The body was warm, the hand supple, the mind in the particular attentive but unforced state that sustained weaving required. He thought about the thread while he worked. The yellow thread came from a supplier in Kumasi who imported it from a factory that produced thread for the kente industry. The thread had been dyed to the Ghana gold specification at the factory. He had been buying this thread for 15 years and the color had been consistent. Before this supplier he had bought from a different source, and before that his father had bought from the sources available in his time, and the thread had been different in each period, different in the quality of the cotton, different in the consistency of the dye, different in how it behaved on the bobbin and through the shed. He had used thread dyed with natural colorants once, when he was in his 30s. A dyer named Asante had been working in a village to the east of Bonwire, producing thread from traditional plant sources, roots and bark and leaves that produced colors that were not quite the same as the commercial equivalents. The natural yellow from this dyer's process was warm in a way the commercial yellow was not. It had variation in it. The color was not perfectly consistent along the length of a skein, shifting slightly in tone with the irregularities of the dye process. In the finished cloth, this variation appeared not as defect but as depth. The cloth had a quality of life that the commercial thread's perfect consistency did not produce. The dyer had died. His apprentices had not continued the practice. The natural dye thread was no longer available. He used the commercial thread and produced good cloth with it. But he had not forgotten the cloth he had made with the natural dye, the 1 or 2 pieces that were in the chest in the back room, showing their particular warm variation to anyone who looked at them in good light. At 11:30 he heard the school children coming back along the road outside the compound wall. The sound of their voices carried over the wall in the still harmattan air, the particular sound of children released from school, the volume and energy of it, and then dispersed as they went to their various compounds. His daughter Amma was among them. He heard the gate open and her quick footsteps across the compound and the house door opening and closing. A few minutes later she came back out and stood at the edge of the weaving area. She was 9 and had the habit of watching the loom for 10 or 15 minutes when she came home from school. She did not speak during the weaving. She had learned this early and did not forget it. She simply stood at the respectful distance that the children in this compound had always kept from the working loom and watched. He was aware of her watching. He did not look at her. He threw the shuttle, beat, changed the shed, threw it back. He was in a supplementary weft float section of the pattern, which required the second pair of heddles to engage in the specific sequence. He worked through the float, confirming each step. Amma watched the shuttle travel back and forth. She watched the kairai move. She watched his feet on the treadles. After 10 minutes she went back inside. He continued the weaving without changing anything. He stopped for the midday meal at 12. He set the shuttle down at the end of a complete ground section, not midsection, not mid-block, but at the natural breaking point where the pattern was in a state that was unambiguous to return to. This was a discipline he had maintained since his first years at the loom. Never stop midsection. Always stop at a point where the position in the pattern was clear without reference to external notes or memory. He washed his hands at the tap in the rear yard. The water was cool, the tap water cold from the pipes in the harmattan season. He washed the thread dust from his fingers, the fine cotton fluff that accumulated in the creases of his knuckles through a working morning. The water ran briefly grey with the day's accumulation and then cleared. The midday meal was at the kitchen table, banku and tilapia soup, the starchy fermented corn and cassava combination that was the standard midday meal in this household. His wife had returned from the market and was at the table. The thread spool was on the kitchen shelf. He noted it briefly, the correct black, the Mensah supplier's label, and sat down. The conversation at the table was the usual, the children's school, a neighbor's news, a question about when the commission would be delivered. He answered the commission question by the end of the week, ahead of the agreed date, and let the other conversation move around him without requiring more than occasional responses. He ate without hurrying. He did not think about the weaving at the table. He drank a second cup of tea after the meal and sat for 15 minutes in the main room. He did not sleep in the afternoon. He had never been able to sleep during the day and did not try. The 15 minutes was a rest of the body rather than the mind, a deliberate absence of the particular alert engagement the loom required. He sat with his eyes not quite closed, the room dim around him, and let the morning's work settle. Then he went back to the loom. The transition from the midday rest to the afternoon weaving was one of the defining moments of the working day. He had spent years learning to manage it well. In his early years at the loom, the return from the midday meal had been a rough recalibration, the body stiffened by sitting, the mind reluctant to re-engage, the first picks of the afternoon arriving with an awkwardness that took half an hour to work through. In later years, the transition had smoothed. He had developed the practice of the 15-minute sitting not as sleep but as specific preparation for the return, the body restoring itself, the pattern reviewing itself in the mind without effort, the hands and feet resting in readiness. When he stood from the chair in the main room, he was already half at the loom. The 20 steps across the compound completed the return. He sat on the bench and looked at the work on the beam. The afternoon light was not yet at its characteristic amber that came later, in the declining afternoon, but the overhead midday intensity had given way to the slightly angled post-noon light that was better for the colors. He could see the yellow clearly. He could distinguish the green accent from the yellow ground at the correct angle. He ran a finger along the last pick. Firm and even. He had left the cloth in a correct state. The return from the break was clean. He loaded a fresh bobbin. The one in the shuttle had been running since before the meal and was nearly depleted, and drew the thread through the notch. He pressed the left treadle and the shed opened, and he threw. The afternoon had its own sounds. The morning had the waking compound, a beaner's fire, the children leaving for school, the birds active in the mango tree. The midday had the meal's activity. The afternoon sounds were different, steadier, less varied. The children were in school. The household had settled into its working state. The main road beyond the compound wall was quieter than in the morning. He preferred the afternoon for one specific kind of assessment, the big picture reading of the cloth. The morning's flat light was better for seeing individual thread behavior, the selvage, the pick density, the accuracy of the supplementary floats. But the afternoon's lower angled light showed the cloth's overall texture and depth in a way that overhead light did not. The three-dimensional quality of the woven surface became visible in low-angle light. The warp-face ground caught the light differently from the weft-face blocks, and the supplementary floats threw tiny shadows that were invisible in overhead light but distinct in the afternoon. He used this quality of the afternoon light 2 or 3 times through the commission's progress, taking a completed strip off the shelf and examining it in the late afternoon angle, assessing the overall impression against the standard he was holding in his mind for this cloth. He had done this with the 3 completed strips 2 days ago. He had been satisfied. The 4 strips were consistent in their overall quality. The 6th would follow. The afternoon work had a different texture from the morning work. The morning work was the work of establishing, the rhythm finding itself, the pattern confirming itself, the body settling into the day. The afternoon work was continuation, the established rhythm maintained, the confirmed pattern proceeding, the body already in its working state. He was not a different weaver in the afternoon. But the afternoon weaver did not need to establish what the morning weaver had already established. The afternoon weaver could simply work. He threw the shuttle. The yellow thread crossed the warp. The kirai beat it home. The afternoon light was different from the morning light. The harmattan haze in the western sky had caught the declining sun and turned it amber, the same diffuse quality as the morning but warmer in tone. The mango tree shadow had shifted from the east to the west, the compound geometry reversed from what it had been at 8. His bench was still in shade. The drag board was in afternoon light, the stones casting short shadows westward. He checked the adweneasa. The afternoon heat, even the modest harmattan heat, which was less intense than the wet season afternoon heat but still substantial, had caused the thread to relax slightly from its morning tension. He moved the drag board forward a centimeter, adding back the tension the heat had taken. He felt the threads and confirmed the adjustment. He sat and began. He worked through the afternoon in the sustained rhythm of a long session. The shuttle traveled. The kirai moved. The cloth built on the beam at its incremental pace, fraction by fraction of an inch with each pick, the accumulation visible only over the course of an hour, the single pick too small a thing to show as progress on any scale he could observe directly. He thought about what his father had said about the adweneasa. Not the technical instruction which had been detailed and specific and had been absorbed into his hands long ago. The observations his father had made about what the pattern meant. His father was not a man who talked much about meaning. He was a craftsman who taught by showing. But occasionally a thought came out of him in the working day, prompted by nothing visible that Kofi had held onto. The pattern is a conversation with the cloth, his father had said once. The weaver says something with each pick. The cloth says something back. You have to listen to the cloth while you are speaking to it. He had been 21 when he heard this. He had been weaving for 6 years and had not yet started the adweneasa. He had understood the observation in a general way. Pay attention to what the cloth is doing, not just what you are telling it to do. He had understood it more specifically over the following years. The cloth gave information in every pick, information about whether the tension was right, whether the color was where it should be, whether the sequence was being executed correctly. The weaver who listened to this information could correct errors before they compounded. The weaver who did not listen was behind the cloth, always catching up. He was not behind the cloth. He had not been behind the cloth for many years. The conversation his father had described was continuous now, below the level of conscious thought, the body receiving the cloth's information and adjusting to it without the mediation of deliberate decision. This was what experience was. Not knowledge that was possessed, but conversation that was continuous. Kweku came across the compound in the mid-afternoon. He stood at the loom's edge and waited. Kofi was in a supplementary float section and finished it before looking up. I counted the strips, Kweku said. The border appears every 24 picks in the main sequence. Correct, Kofi said. And the interval shifts in the border repeat itself. The burgundy and black do not simply alternate. He looked at Kweku. The young man had looked more carefully than Kofi had expected. Correct, he said again. The burgundy sequence is 4-4. Not 2-2. The 4-pick length is what produces the color depth. Kweku nodded. He had seen it in the cloth. He was not receiving the information now as instruction. He was confirming what he had already found. This was the transition point Kofi waited for in a learner's development. Before the transition, the learner received instruction and stored it. After the transition, the learner went to the cloth and found the instruction there, already embedded in the work. The cloth became the teacher. The master's role was to point at the cloth and say, "Look here." He reached the end of the afternoon session when the light dropped below the color threshold. The sun was behind the western rooftop, the compound in shadow, the last amber light in the sky above the mango tree. He could still see the cloth, but the yellow had become an uncertain pale, and the distinction between the green accent and the yellow ground was no longer reliable. He set the shuttle down. He examined the day's production. He had woven approximately 8 inches of the 4th strip since the previous evening's cutoff. Added to the 4 inches from yesterday's afternoon, the strip was now 12 inches on the beam. When cut and relaxed, this would be 17 or 18 inches. The full strip required approximately 40 inches on the beam, corresponding to the target finished length of 60 inches. He was at a third of the way through the current strip. 2 full working days remained for this strip. Then the 5th strip. Then the 6th. The schedule was correct. He thought about the accumulated progress of the commission. 4 strips on the shelf, the 5th in progress. The cloth existed in pieces at this point, not as a cloth. A joa would make it a cloth. But the pieces had been made correctly, and the cloth would be what it was supposed to be when they were assembled. He had worked with a joa for 15 years. She received the strips from him, checked their measurements and alignment, sewn them together with the fine hand stitching that kente assembly required, and returned the assembled cloth pressed and folded. Her seaming was invisible. A well-assembled kente cloth showed no seam lines, the pattern running continuously from edge to edge, as if the cloth had been woven in one piece. He had referred clients to her for finishing work, and she had referred clients to him for weaving work, and this exchange had been the practice for 15 years without difficulty. The understanding between them was professional, each delivered to the highest standard each was capable of, and the combined result was better than either could achieve alone. He thought about the client who had introduced them. A woman from a family in Accra, who had brought strips from 3 different weavers and needed them assembled, and who had asked his father, who was still weaving at the time, where the best finishing work in Bonwire was done. His father had sent her to Adjoa. The commission had been difficult. The strips were from 3 different weavers with slightly different tension standards, and aligning them correctly had required Adjoa's considerable skill, but the finished cloth had been acceptable. The woman had come back to Kofi's compound for the next commission, having learned that beginning with a single weaver was the better approach. He had thought about this client's experience when he set his own standards for what he would deliver to Adwoneasa. The strips had to be correct in their measurements and their tension so that the assembler's work was not made difficult by the weaver's inconsistencies. This was part of the weaver's responsibility. The cloth began with the weaver's warp and ended with the assembler's seam, and both parties had to perform for the result to be good. He covered the loom carefully at the end of each day with the cotton wrapper, checking that the cloth on the beam was protected from the dew and from birds. He had lost a partial strip to birds once. Early in his career, a sunbird had pulled at the loose end of the cloth on the beam and unraveled half a day's work before he noticed. He had added 2 additional tie points to the covering cloth after that and had not had the problem again. Small losses had their uses. They produced the habit of preventing the next one. He covered the loom and tied the cords. He moved the adweneasa back to the overnight position and felt the thread's tension settle. He gathered the shuttles and bobbins and took them inside to the storeroom. In the storeroom he arranged the shuttles on the shelf in their order for the next morning: yellow first, then black, then green, then burgundy. He sorted the bobbins into the box, full ones at one end and used ones at the other, so he could see at a glance how much wound thread he had in reserve. He had 3 full yellow bobbins left, which was enough for the morning session. He would wind more in the evening. He stood at the storeroom shelf and looked at the 4 completed strips. They were folded in the presentation fold he always used, once lengthwise, then twice across, making a compact rectangle. He picked up the first strip and unfolded it to look at the pattern in the storeroom's indoor light. Indoor light gave a different view from outdoor light. Some details that were obvious outdoors were less clear inside. Some details that were hard to see in outdoor directional light were clear in flat indoor light. He checked in both. The first strip was correct. He refolded it and returned it to the shelf. He washed his hands at the rear yard tap. He washed the thread dust from his knuckles and between his fingers, scrubbing with the small brush kept at the tap for this purpose. The harmattan had made the skin of his hands dry and slightly rough through the afternoon. He applied a small amount of shea butter from the tin on the windowsill of the rear room, working it into the backs of his hands and his fingers. He had done this every harmattan for as long as he could remember. The harmattan dried everything, including the hands of weavers who handled dry cotton thread all day. He stood at the tap for a moment after washing. The rear yard was in evening shadow. His wife's pawpaw tree was a dark shape against the pale western sky. The guinea fowl had settled in the far corner of the yard, their evening calls subsiding. The compound beyond the inner wall was quiet. He thought about the schedule. 4 strips done. 2 remaining. The delivery was in 10 days. He was ahead by at least 2 days. This margin was not an opportunity to slow down. It was insurance, the buffer that allowed for anything unexpected. He had been in enough commissions to know that the buffer was worth maintaining. A thread problem, a heddle cord failure, a morning when the warp tension was impossible to stabilize, any of these could cost a day. The buffer was there for exactly these events. The 5th and 6th strips would be the smoothest work of the commission. This was always the case. The first strip carried the friction of establishing the warp, the second strip, the residual uncertainty of the first, the middle strips the steady work of the running phase, and the final strips the accumulated fluency of full familiarity. He expected the 5th and 6th to go well. He went inside and sat in the main room while his wife finished the evening meal. His son Yor came home from school with a question about homework, something mathematical, beyond Kofi's memory of school mathematics, and Kofi suggested he ask the teacher in the morning. His daughter Amma was at the table with a book, reading with the focused attention she gave to everything, the same quality of attention Kofi gave to the loom. He had noticed this about her for years. He had no opinion about what she should do with her life. He simply noticed that she had this quality, and whatever she chose to do with it would probably go well. After the evening meal he sat in the storeroom with the hand winder on the small table and wound 4 replacement yellow bobbins. The winding was quiet work, the room lit by the overhead bulb, the thread drawing off the spool in a slow spiral and distributing itself evenly across the turning cylinder. He wound each bobbin to 3/4 fill. Too full and the thread packed at the edges and paid off unevenly at the end of the bobbin's life. Too sparse and he was changing bobbins more often than necessary. He set the 4 bobbins in the box. He looked at the shuttles on the shelf. He looked at the 4 completed strips on the shelf below. He turned off the light and went to find his wife. They sat together for a time in the main room, the television on at low volume, the children asleep. He was not watching the television. He was reviewing the 5th strip structure in his mind, the ground sections in their sequence, the weft face blocks at their intervals, the supplementary float pattern in order, the border at its specified position in the repeat. He confirmed each element. They were correct. The 5th strip was in him. He would start it in the morning. He went to bed with the strip structure settled in his mind, and the warp thread's overnight behavior already calculated somewhere below thought, the harmattan cold, the expected contraction, the position of the drag board when he arrived at the loom before dawn. He stood in the compound in the early evening light. The harmattan afterglow was in the western sky, not a sunset exactly, because the harmattan obscured the sun's disk well before the horizon, but a gradual deepening of the amber tone in the west and a corresponding pale orange above the eastern rooftop. The first stars were appearing through the haze, reduced in brightness but visible, Orion just above the western wall, the belt stars distinct. He thought about the cloth. Not the technical aspects, those were settled for the day, but about what the cloth would become when Adjoa had assembled the 6 strips and pressed it and folded it in the presentation style. He had seen his cloths worn by their owners at occasions. He had seen the Owusu family's previous commission, the one made for the grandfather and now photographed at a ceremony in Kumasi some years ago, worn by a man he did not know on an occasion he had attended on a different invitation. He had recognized the cloth immediately. The burgundy and black border treatment was visible from across the room. He had not gone over to examine it closely. There was no need. He had known it from the making. The evening meal was simple, kelewel, fried spiced plantain with rice. He ate at the table with the household and did not talk much about the day. After the meal his wife asked about the thread her mother had requested for an embroidery project, a question he could not help with. He suggested the market. The children did their homework at the table. He sat in the main room and thought about the 4th bobbin. The 4th yellow bobbin in the box, the one he had wound slightly thin, noticed in the morning, was the 2nd in order for the next session start. He had used the 1st yellow bobbin through the afternoon. The thin 4th one was now the 3rd, working forward in the stack as the bobbins were used. When he reached it tomorrow, it would run low at an earlier point in the sequence than the standard bobbins. He would watch for it. The thread thinning on the cylinder was visible before the thread ran out, and the visible thinning was usually a reliable 10 or 15 picks warning. He wound a replacement bobbin before bed. He sat in the storeroom with the hand winder on the small table and drew yellow thread from the spool onto a fresh cylinder, distributing it evenly. The motion of winding was different from the motion of weaving but came from the same trained hands, the same attention to evenness. He wound slowly. He set the bobbin in the box and went to bed. The cut and delivery of the 4th strip had gone as expected. He had done the same on the 5th, completed the strip by early afternoon, cut it, folded it, added it to the shelf. The 6th strip was what the morning now held. He reviewed the Owusu Commission's total before beginning. 6 strips. The color combination his father had used for this family 30 years ago, and that the family had returned for ever since. The adweneasa structure correctly executed in each strip. The green accent visible at the correct angle. The burgundy and black border in the 4/4 sequence at the specified interval. All of it correct in the 5 strips on the shelf. He thought about Kwabena Owusu receiving the cloth. He thought about the marriage ceremony the families gathered in the Owusu compound, the cloth on its wearer in the occasion that had given rise to the commission 3 months ago. He had attended such gatherings as a guest of families who had commissioned from him. He had seen the cloth he had made, worn by the person it was made for, in the context of the occasion that had required it. There was something in this that completed a circle. The cloth began as an intention, a description given by the client of an occasion and what was needed for it. The cloth then became a process of making, the long days at the loom, the strip-by-strip accumulation. Then the cloth became itself, the finished strips sewn together, pressed and folded. Then it became an occasion, worn, visible, doing the thing it was made to do. He did not attend every commission's occasion. Some were private, some at a distance, some he was not invited to. But when he had seen a cloth he had made worn correctly, he had felt a quiet completion. The cloth had arrived where it was supposed to be. The second morning was colder than the first. The harmattan temperature dropped through the week as the season deepened, the cold becoming more insistent day by day until sometime in January or February it reached its lowest point and then began, almost imperceptibly, to ease back. He woke in the dark and lay for a moment under the blanket, feeling the cold on his face and the warmth beneath the cloth. Then he got up. He did the compound crossing in the darkness, the same route across the swept earth, the same cold underfoot. He uncovered the loom and checked the untied. It had moved nearly 3 centimeters overnight, the threads contracting significantly in the deep harmattan cold. He moved the board back and checked the tension. He moved it back another centimeter and checked again. The thread was very taut. He moved the board forward 1 centimeter, releasing a fraction of the tension he had corrected. The thread was right. He loaded the shuttles and set up the first bobbin. He ran his hand along the warp threads, counting the units, confirming the color arrangement. Everything was in order. He pressed the left treadle and began. The second day ran with the accumulated clarity of a commission in its later stages. He had been working on this cloth for 5 days. The pattern was in him completely, not as knowledge to be accessed but as physical readiness, the body already positioned for each element before the element arrived. He was 2/3 through the 4th strip at the start of the session. He would complete it by mid-morning. The 4th bobbin ran thin at the predicted point. He watched the thread level on the cylinder drop, the warning visible in time to finish the current section before the thread exhausted. He changed bobbins at the natural stopping point, a clean transition, no break. He worked through the final third of the strip. The kente sound had the particular quality that long work produced, not louder or different in timing, but slightly deeper in resonance, the wood of the kente having absorbed some warmth from the morning and the contact with the warp, a subtly different tone from the first cold picks of the session. He had noticed this quality in the kente sound for many years. It was one of the things that told him the session was running well. He cut the 4th strip at 11. He held it in his hands and stretched it, feeling the relaxation. He folded it and added it to the others on the storeroom shelf. 4 strips done. He returned to the loom and looked at the remaining warp. 2 strips length of threads clean and taut in the midday light. He loaded the yellow shuttle and began the 5th. The 5th strip's warp was the cleanest of the commission. The first strip had carried the early adjustments, the adweneasa finding its correct setting, the heddle cord tensions confirming themselves, the small variations that appeared as a new warp settled into its working state. The 2nd and 3rd strips had held the residual effects of those corrections. By the 4th strip, the warp was in its established phase. The 5th was the 2nd strip of that phase, and it showed in the cloth. He began the 5th at mid-afternoon. The light was declining from the midday angle but still good for colors. He took the first picks carefully, checking the color sequence, confirming the arrangement. The threads were cooperative. He threw the shuttle. The opening ground section ran without effort. He was not managing the sequence consciously. The hands and feet managed it below deliberate thought, the body having made this exact sequence in this exact warp 4 times already. He was aware of the compound around him, the distant road, the guinea fowl, Kweku's afternoon rhythm behind him. He was not attending to these sounds. They were simply present. He was weaving. The weft face block insertions in the fifth strip were the most consistent he had produced in this commission. Not because he was trying to make them more consistent. His hands had made 16 of them in the previous strips, and the body had found the precision that accumulated repetition produces. The block edges were sharp. The transitions were clean. The pick count through each block was not counted deliberately. His body knew 16. His father had used the word settled. A settled warp. A settled weaver. Settled did not mean easy. It meant that everything requiring adjustment had already been adjusted, and what remained was the work itself, proceeding in conditions that no longer required attention. The difficulty was gone because it had been worked through. He was in the settled phase of this commission, and the cloth showed it. He reached the first supplementary float section of the fifth strip and moved through the 4 treadle sequence. The foot motion was automatic. He confirmed each element, came back to the ground, continued. He thought, one more after this. Not with anticipation or relief. As a simple fact of the commission's progress. He was on the 5th of 6 strips, and one more followed. The commission had been 6 strips of adweneasa for a marriage cloth from the first day of the warp setup. He was nearly there. He threw the shuttle through the ground section and listened to the sound of the kirai in the harmattan afternoon. The light from the west gave the yellow its truest version, the warm gold fully visible, the brass quality it had in the declining hours. He had woven hundreds of strips in this light and knew exactly what it showed him. The 5th strip had the character that each successive strip in a commission had, the pattern more deeply embedded, the sequence more automatic, the rhythm slightly faster than the previous strip while the quality remained constant. He was not weaving faster as an act of will. He was weaving faster because the accumulated practice of the commission was reducing the fraction of each pick sequence that was conscious and increasing the fraction that was mechanical. The mechanical fraction, in a skilled weaver, was at least as accurate as the conscious fraction. It was simply faster. He wove through the afternoon with the household sounds around him, the children back from school, the guinea fowl in the compound, his wife and Abena in the kitchen. He reached the end of the 5th strip at 4 in the afternoon, the light still good enough to work. He cut it and folded it. 5 strips done. He stood at the storeroom shelf with all 5 strips before him and looked at them for a moment. He had the habit of reviewing the full set before beginning the final strip of a commission. Not checking, the checking was done in the individual assessment of each strip as it was cut, but looking at the commission as a whole. The 5 strips laid side by side represented 5 days of work. The 6th would represent the 6th. He looked at the pattern across all 5. The color was consistent. The adweneasa structure was correct in each one. The border treatment was positioned correctly in each one. A person who knew cloth would be able to tell these strips had been woven in the same week by the same weaver on the same warp. A person who did not know cloth would simply see 5 pieces of the same fabric. He looked at the green accent in the afternoon light, the slight green element visible at the oblique angle in the warp face sections. It was in the same position in all 5 strips. The Owusu family would see it. They had been told about it when the first Owusu commission was made 30 years ago. It was part of what the family came to Bonwire for. He refolded the strips and looked at the remaining warp. 1 strip's length of threads, taut and clean. The Netuesuo sat at the end of the unwoven section, the stones casting their small shadows in the afternoon light. His father had said, "The last strip is a conversation you know well. You have said everything in it 5 times already. Say it once more, and say it correctly." He did not begin the 6th strip that afternoon. The light was declining and he had been at the loom since before dawn. He covered the loom and went inside. The 6th strip would be the work of tomorrow morning. He woke before the compound stirred. The harmattan cold was deep. He dressed in the dark and crossed the compound and uncovered the loom and adjusted the adweneasa and set up the shuttles and stood for a moment looking at the last warp. In the growing light he could see the thread colors clearly, the yellow dominant, the black threaded through in its places, the green threads in their specific positions within the warp arrangement. He knew every thread in this warp. Not individually, a warp had hundreds of threads, and he did not know each one separately, but as a system, the arrangement as a whole, the color sequence as a continuous thing. He had held this arrangement in his hands for a week. He knew it. He sat on the bench and pressed the left treadle. The sixth strip began the way the other five had begun, with the first shed opening, the first throw of the shuttle, the first beat of the kirai. The motion was the same motion. The pattern was the same pattern. The thread was the same thread. The cloth that would result would be, in the assembled final cloth, indistinguishable from the other five strips to any eye that was not his. He worked through the opening ground section of the sixth strip with the ease that five previous strips had built. The heddle sequence was in him. The shed opened correctly under the pressure of his foot. The shuttle cleared the warp cleanly. The kirai came forward from the elbow, level across the full width. Each element of the motion was what 25 years of the same motion had made it, not performed but simply occurring, the way a practiced walk occurs without the walker managing each step. He reached the first weft-face block of the sixth strip and moved through it without counting the picks consciously. His body knew 16. He completed the block and resumed the ground. He reached the first supplementary float section and worked through the four treadle sequence, the hands and feet moving in the specific pattern that float production required, different from the ground sequence, different again from the block sequence. His body knew this too. He worked through it and came back to the ground. The morning compound was around him, as it was every morning, a bina at the cooking fire, the agama on the wall in the first sun, the sound of Kweku's loom starting up across the compound. He was aware of all of it in the peripheral way of the experienced weaver. He was not distracted by it. He was not inattentive to it. He was simply weaving in his compound on a harmattan morning, which was what he did, and the compound was the place where he did it. The sixth strip had a particular quality that came from a commission in its final stage. Not just the accumulated fluency of the previous strips, which was present, but something more specific, the knowledge that every element of the pattern had already been made correctly 5 times and was therefore thoroughly known. He was not making the adweneasa in the sixth strip. He was making it again. The prior knowledge meant that each step was recognition rather than decision. He thought about this while the ground section ran. The quality of the sixth strip was not better than the quality of the first strip in any objective sense. Both had been made correctly. But the sixth strip had a quality of ease that the first had not. The first strip required the weaver to construct each decision. The sixth strip required the weaver to confirm each step. Confirmation was lighter than construction. The cloth came from this lightness. He reached the border treatment of the sixth strip. He set down the yellow shuttle and took up the burgundy. He pressed his foot into the border shed sequence. The burgundy thread crossed the warp. The black followed. He worked through the 12-pick sequence and came back to the yellow. The border in the sixth strip was exact. He knew it was exact without measuring it. 22 years of this border treatment had placed the exactness below measurement. He came to the supplementary float section of the final repeat and moved through it. The floats were correct. He came back to the ground for the final run. He worked through the morning. He worked through the border treatment section when it came. He checked the pick density at mid-morning and found it correct. He examined the selve edge at the same time and found it straight. He checked the green accent at the oblique angle the morning light provided and found it in its correct position. Everything was as it should be. To his eye there was a distinction. The sixth strip was the cleanest work of the commission. This was always true of the last strip. The first strip carried the setup tension, the first day adjustments, the learning of this specific warp's particular behavior. The middle strips carried the steady work of the commission's running phase. The last strip carried the accumulated knowledge of all the previous strips, every adjustment already made, every quirk of the warp already accommodated. The last strip was the commission at its most fluid. He worked through it without stopping. He moved through the ground sections and the block insertions and the supplementary float sequences with the ease of something thoroughly learned. He managed the color changes and the border treatments with the confidence of repetition. He reached the midpoint of the strip at mid-morning and continued into the final hour. The end came in the late morning. He was in the last section of the ground when he became aware of it, not from counting but from the changed sound of the shed opening. As a warp approached exhaustion, the shed geometry shifted slightly, the remaining unwoven threads shortening and altering the tension distribution across the width. He had been hearing this particular change for 20 years. He heard it now. The pitch of the shed opening was a fraction higher. The kirai came forward with a marginally different resistance. He was in the last portion of the last strip. He worked through the final picks at his ordinary pace. He was not hurrying. He was not marking the moment with ceremony. He was weaving at the same pace as the first pick of the first strip, and the cloth was doing what the cloth did, and the commission was arriving at its end. He held the final pick for a moment before setting it. He was aware of the last pick in the way he was aware of the last pick of every commission, not with ceremony, but with attention. He had made this motion 100,000 times, and would make it many more times before he was done. This particular last pick was one of them. He pulled the kirai toward him for the final time. The thread pressed into the cloth. He released the kirai and set the shuttle on the board. He looked at the strip on the beam. He cut the 6th strip with the flat knife, one clean stroke through the threads at the warp line. The strip separated with the quick succession of small sounds that cutting a tensioned warp produced. He held it in his hands and stretched it. The cloth took its relaxed length. He folded it and carried it to the storeroom. The 6 strips were on the shelf, 4 from the earlier days, then the 5th from yesterday afternoon, now the 6th from this morning. He took all 6 out and laid them on the assessment table. 2 strips wide, 3 strips long, the full commission visible at once in the afternoon light. The color was consistent across all 6. The adweneasa structure was correct throughout. The pattern elements, the warp face ground, the weft face block insertions, the supplementary floats, the border treatment in burgundy and black were in the right positions and in the right proportions in each strip. The strips would assemble correctly. When Adjoa sewn them together, the stripes and the borders would run continuously across the full cloth. The green accent, visible at the oblique angle the afternoon light provided, appeared in the same positions in each of the 6 strips. He held one strip up to the light. The yellow glowed with the warmth it had when the light came through it. The black remained dense. The burgundy in the border treatment was the color of old wine, warm against the yellow. He refolded the strips in the presentation order. He would take them to Adjoa in the morning. Adjoa's compound was 2 streets over, a 10-minute walk on the lanes between the weaving compounds of Bonwire. He had walked those lanes carrying finished strips for 15 years. The lanes were red laterite like all the paths of the village, and in harmattan season the fine surface dust moved in small drifts at the corners of the compound walls where the wind eddied. He would wrap the strips in a cloth for the carrying, as he always did, not from any particular concern about the short walk, but because the habit of protecting finished work was correct practice. Adjoa would receive the strips with the careful attention she brought to everything. She would lay them out on her assembly table and check the measurements, each strip's length, each strip's width, confirming the consistency of all 6 before beginning the seaming. If anything was marginally out of standard, she would tell him before she began rather than after. She had told him once, years ago, that a strip was a fraction of an inch short of the specified length, and they had agreed together that it was within acceptable tolerance for the assembly. In 15 years of working together, that had been the only discussion of measurement variation. He looked at the 6 strips on the shelf one final time. They were what they were. The work was done. The cloth would be Adjoa's to complete, and then Kwabena Owusu's to carry, and then the occasions to use. He had made his part correctly. The rest would follow from that. He turned off the storeroom light and closed the door and went to the main room to sit with his wife. The harmattan night settled over the compound. The temperature dropped. The stars appeared through the dust layer, their light diminished but present. He sat in the warm room for a time, not thinking about anything in particular, and then went to bed. He lay in the dark, and the loom was covered in the compound outside, and the commission was done, and the night was quiet around him. He came back to the compound and stood at the loom. The loom was empty now, the beam bare, the heddle strings hanging slack, the kerai resting against the upper frame. The adweneasa sat at the end of the unwoven warp length, the stones piled on their board, the weight waiting. He would set up a new warp for the next commission, a cloth for a family in Accra, a simpler pattern than adweneasa, 3 strips later in the week, after the delivery to Owusu was complete. He covered the empty loom and tied the cords. The compound was in the late afternoon. The mango tree's shadow extended westward across the terracotta earth. The harmattan sky above was the amber it became in the declining hours, the same pale white of the morning deepened by the angle of the afternoon light. The guinea fowl were in the compound, their small deliberate movements across the earth unchanged by anything that had happened above them. He stood under the mango tree and looked at the covered loom and did not think about anything specific. He had made this cloth. The commission was done. The cloth was on the shelf in the storeroom, ready for Ajoa's hands, and then for the Owusu family, and then for the occasion it had been made for. It would go out of the compound, and he would not see most of what happened to it. He might see it worn at some point, as he had seen the grandfather's cloth from across a room. He might not. The cloth would be what it was. The work that had gone into it would not be visible in any individual thread or any single pick, but would be present in the cloth's total quality, in the density of the surface and the evenness of the structure and the accuracy of the color relationships. A person who knew cloth would see the work without being able to point at where it was. A person who did not know cloth would simply see a cloth of quality. Both would be correct. The evening came on slowly in the harmattan way, the amber deepening by degrees without the dramatic color change of the wet season sunset. The stars appeared through the dust layer, diminished in brightness but present in their usual patterns. Orion was above the western wall. The broad band of the Milky Way was faint but traceable across the high sky. He stayed in the compound after the evening meal, standing near the mango tree in the dark. The tree was still above him, its dusty leaves moving slightly in the evening air. The compound was quiet, the children inside, the guinea fowl settled in the rear yard, the road beyond the gate distant and intermittent. He thought about tomorrow. The delivery to Ajoa in the morning. The new warp later in the week. The Accra commission, a simpler pattern, a cloth for a young man's graduation. There was a commission inquiry from a family in Sunyani that he had not yet replied to. He would reply this week. The work continued. Each commission led to the next. Each cloth was an occasion for someone, a gathering or a ceremony or a transition, and the cloth was made for the occasion and served it and then became part of the family's holding, added to the store of cloth that families accumulated over generations, the cloth that was brought out for the significant moments and put away between them. He had been adding to this accumulation for 25 years. His father before him. His grandfather before that. The accumulation was not visible in any single cloth but in the aggregate. The many households in Kumasi and Accra and Sunyani and further that had cloth from this compound, cloth made with the Mensah family's technique and the Mensah family's specific border treatments and the Mensah family's version of the adweneasa pattern. He did not think of this as a legacy exactly. He thought of it as the work doing what the work did, continuing. The harmattan night was settling into the compound. The cold was deepening. He could feel it on the backs of his hands, the drying quality of it, the slight tightening of the skin. He had felt this every harmattan night of his life, and the feeling was as much a part of the season as the pale sky, and the long cold mornings and the particular sound of the dry leaves in the mango tree above him. He looked at the covered loom. The white cotton cloth covering it was pale in the starlight. The drag board was a dark shape at the end of the bare warp, the stones invisible in the dark but there. He knew they were there. He went inside when the cold reached through the wrapper. He stood for a moment at the window of the main room, looking out at the compound. The mango tree was a dark shape. The covered loom was a low, still presence under it. He sat, and the compound was quiet around him. The morning was cold and dark when he rose. He dressed quietly and took the storeroom key from its hook by the door. He crossed the compound in the darkness. The harmattan had the deep cold of the early hour, before the sun had climbed high enough to affect it. He turned on the storeroom light. The 6 strips were on the shelf in the presentation order he had set them. He did not examine them again. They were what he had found them to be. He took the white wrapping cloth from its shelf and laid it flat on the assessment table. He placed the 6 strips in the center in their presentation order and brought the cloth around them. He tied the 2 cord ties and tested the bundle, compact, firm, the strips protected. He left the compound before the household was fully up. Adweneasa was at the cooking fire, rekindling the coals from the previous night. She looked up as he crossed toward the gate and saw the bundle under his arm. She did not speak. She knew the look of a delivery morning. The lane outside was pale and cool. The harmattan had laid its fine dust on every surface overnight, the laterite path, the compound walls, the leaves of the mango trees overhanging the lane at intervals. The village was waking. From the nearest compound he heard the first picks of a morning session, tentative, the weaver finding the rhythm. Further along the lane another loom was running steadily. He walked without attending to these sounds. They were the sounds of this lane. He had walked through them for 25 years. At the junction he turned east. The main road was visible from here, the tarmac pale with harmattan dust, a truck moving slowly north toward Mampong in the flat morning light. He turned away from the road and went down the quieter lane toward adweneasa's compound. The weaving compounds of Bonwire extended in this direction. The same form repeated, compound after compound, each with its swept earth and mango tree and the particular silence or sound of its morning. He had known every one of these compounds since childhood. Adweneasa's gate was open when he arrived. He called from outside and heard her answer. He went in. Her assembly table was already prepared, cleared, covered with the plain cotton underlayer she used for seaming, the tools of her work arranged at the near end. She had been expecting him. He set the bundle on the table and untied it. She took the first strip and unfolded it. She worked with her hands before her eyes, feeling the cloth surface, feeling the pick density, running a fingertip along the selvage. Then she held it at arm's length in the morning light from the window. She examined the warp face at the correct angle. She folded it carefully and moved to the second. He stood to one side. He had watched her do this examination many times and understood that it was not for his benefit. She was building her own knowledge of the cloth before she began to work with it. The assembly would proceed from that knowledge, and the knowledge needed to be hers. She moved through the 6 strips without speaking. When she reached the 6th, she held the yellow ground up to the window. The morning light came through it and the yellow glowed. She set it down. "Thursday," she said. He confirmed Thursday. He picked up the wrapping cloth and folded it for the walk back. She had already turned to her assembly table by the time he reached the gate. He paused in the middle of Adweneasa's compound, in the small moment between the assessment room and the gate. Her compound was older than his, the walls thicker, the tree in the center a larger mango than his own, its trunk a grade column. 2 of her apprentices were at the far end, working over a length of assembled cloth with the flat pressing tools of the finisher's trade. They did not look up. He went through the gate. The return lane was lighter than it had been going out. The sun was above the rooftops now, its disk washed out by the harmattan but present, the morning warming slightly. The looms along the lane were fully running, the village in its working hour. He walked back to his compound through the harmattan morning sounds. At the gate he paused for a moment. The sounds came from all sides, the looms from the surrounding compounds, the road beyond the junction, a woman calling from behind a wall somewhere to the east. He had been born into these sounds. They were the village's working voice. They had not changed in his lifetime and would not change after it. He went inside and ate with the household. When he came back to the compound after breakfast, the morning was fully established. The agama was on the wall in the first sun, its orange head vivid in the flat harmattan light. Quiku was at his loom, the rhythm regular and steady. The mango tree was overhead, its harmattan grey leaves still against the pale sky. He stood at the empty loom. The beam was bare. The heddle frames hung slack. The kerai rested against the upper bar. The netuesuo sat at the end of the unwoven warp, the stones piled on their board, the weight present but unneeded. He thought about the Accra commission. A graduation cloth, 3 strips, a stripe pattern in the family's colors, a simpler task than the owusu cloth by a considerable distance. The thread was already on the shelf. He would set the warp this week. He went to the storeroom and brought out the measuring pegs. He drove the first pair into the compound earth at the standard interval, the positions his feet knew from hundreds of warp setups. He drove the far pegs. He checked the distance. The mango tree was above him. The harmattan sky was above the mango tree. The compound was in its working morning state, the same state it had been in every working morning of his adult life. He took the measuring cord in his hands. The cord was a length of untied cotton thread he had used for measuring warps for 15 years, marked at the standard intervals with small knots. It was stiff with handling, the cotton slightly hardened from years of the same use. He knew the distance between each knot without measuring. He had walked them many hundreds of times. The first peg was in the ground. The thread was on the shelf. The steps arranged themselves without planning, each following the one before with the logic of a sequence that had been the same for 25 years. The warp was about to begin.